joined the Convention Against Torture. President Reagan was very interested in the problem of torture around the world. And so he signed that treaty, and then it was ratified by the Senate under President Clinton. So you can see these first three treaties, there was a lot of bipartisan interest in being part of these human rights treaties. Both Republicans and Democrats were interested in being part of the treaties. However, some of the other treaties, the U.S. is not part of. And so if we could go on to the next slide, there are 4 other human rights treaties that the U.S. has signed, but the Senate has not ratified. So one was the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Treaty. President Carter, who was very interested in human rights, signed that one, but the Senate did not ratify it. The same is true for the Women's Treaty. This is the one we're looking at tonight. President Carter signed it, but the Senate has never ratified it. I'll talk a little more about that. The 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child. President Clinton signed this on behalf of the United States, but it has never been ratified by the Senate. This one is a little outstanding because the U.S. is the only country in the world that is not part of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Every other country in the world is part of this convention and tries to pay attention to the rights of the child. But the U.S. Is not part of this treaty. And then finally, President Obama signed the Treaty on Persons with Disabilities, but the Senate never ratified that. Now, for the Disabilities Treaty, this was really based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was an amazing law that led the way globally on the rights of disabled people. But as you can see, we nonetheless have not ratified that Human Rights Convention. And then there's 2 other human rights treaties, the last 2 of the 9 core human rights treaties that the U.S. has taken no action on, neither signing it or ratifying it. The first one has to do with migrant workers. The second one has to do with people who are disappeared by their countries. So you can see in looking at the women's treaties, Women's Treaty, it's in the context of these human rights treaties, which some have been joined by the United States, others have not. Now, of these that the U.S. has signed but not ratified, in every case, it is Democratic presidents that signed them, and then the Republican-dominated Senate that has who has not ratified them. Okay, so looking at the Women's Treaty here, looking at the Women's Treaty originated in the first UN World Conference on Women. This was a big conference that took place in Mexico City in 1975. It was organized by the UN, brought, like all these UN conferences, brought countries from across the world to Mexico City to think about women's rights. And in addition to the countries that came to this meeting, there were many, many civil society organizations that went to Mexico City, and altogether, everyone talked about what was needed to advance women's rights. It was all part of the International Decade on Women from 1975 to 1985. So that conference, the Mexico City Conference on Women, called for the development of a comprehensive treaty on women. There were some treaties on women's nationality, on women in the family, but there was no comprehensive treaty on women's rights. And so that was called for by the first World Conference on Women. And it was developed over the next few years under the auspices of the Commission on the Status of Women. By 1979, it was completed, adopted by the UN General Assembly, and then opened up for signatures. And so the full title of the Women's Treaty is Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So that's kind of wordy, like so much that the UN develops. And so it's usually referred to by its acronym, CEDAW, and CEDAW just stands for the title. So the treaty is usually referred to as CEDAW. So CEDAW has 30 articles that set out women's human rights. So I'm just going to list some of those so you get an idea of the comprehensive nature of the Women's Treaty. For instance, so when countries join the Women's Treaty, it's not automatic that, of course, they do all of these things right away, but countries commit that they're going to try to bring their laws and practices in line with the provisions of the treaty. So, for instance, on legal rights, countries commit to affirm equal rights in their national constitutions. So constitutions will say men and women have equal rights in their country. Countries commit to ensure equal rights in courts of law. So if there are discriminatory laws, they commit to try to change those laws. So there's women can conclude contracts and administer property. So those are example of all legal rights. There are also provisions that countries should suppress trafficking in women, a huge international problem, criminal enterprise, international trafficking in women and girls. And so countries agree that they're going to work to stop human trafficking in women. And as part of that, they're going to suppress the exploitation of women and girls in prostitution. So the treaty doesn't exactly say stop prostitution, but it certainly recognizes there's a link between prostitution and trafficking. And so countries agree to work on those connections and to suppress trafficking and exploitation. There's a provision for political and citizenship rights of women. The most important one, of course, is the right to vote, but also to serve in office and to represent their country internationally as diplomats. There's a very strong principle in the UN that women have the right to be diplomats as well. And the UN features many, many female diplomats, including from some quite conservative countries. And then there are nationality rights. Women have a right to retain nationality once they marry. In some countries, if a woman marries a non-national, so a man from another country, she sometimes loses her own nationality or cannot pass her nationality on to her children. And so countries that join the Women's Treaty agree to work on those laws so that women can retain their nationality and pass it along to their children. Okay, and so in addition to these rights, the Women's Treaty affirms women's educational rights, equal rights to all levels of education, vocational, primary, secondary, tertiary, graduate education, adult education in both urban and rural areas, and that the materials that are used in education, whether textbooks, curricula, will treat men and women fairly and equally, and will not promote a society in which men have more power than women or more authority than women. Countries also agree to work towards equality in scholarships and in sports programs. And they agree to include education on family planning in the course of their educational programs so that women have the knowledge they need to plan their families and to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Then there are employment rights. And I think we've heard a lot about that in the US, a right to equal pay for equal work, a right to equality under social security systems, to safe working conditions, especially during times of pregnancy, that women's jobs will be protected if they take time off from pregnancy, that women will have maternity leave with pay. So not just leave, but leave with pay. And that enable women to work, that countries will develop a network of childcare facilities. Women can't work outside their home if they're also responsible for taking care of children. So providing childcare, very important part of advancing women's rights. The treaty also guarantees women's rights in health systems, the right to receive medical care on an equal basis with men. And the treaty specifies that during pregnancy, women should receive free services. So they don't have to pay for services, medical services during pregnancy. Not only when she's pregnant, but also in the postnatal period. And that women, there's some provision to provide women with adequate nutrition during pregnancy and after pregnancy when she's breastfeeding her child. And then there are also rights to equal participation in financial life, to have access to credit, bank loans and mortgages on an equal basis with men without requiring a male signature on a loan. For women in rural areas, that they will be treated equally in terms of access to agricultural credit. A lot of women in the world are rural women. And so the treaty does pay special attention to the rights of rural women, especially the right to participate in development processes, planning, carrying out development programs, and being the beneficiaries of development programs as well. And when a country engages in a program of land reform or land distribution, that women have equal access to those benefits as well. And then finally, the treaty talks about marriage and family rights, and underlines a woman's right to choose her spouse with free and full consent. A woman or a girl cannot be forced to marry against her will. She has to give her free consent. Now, so this is the goal. It doesn't necessarily work out that way in every country, but this is the goal. And when countries sign on to the treaty, they agree to work towards that goal. Women have the right to decide on spacing of children and to have access to medical care that's going to give them the capability to space their children, such as contraception. The treaty doesn't mention abortion, but it does say women should have access to the full spectrum of reproductive rights. Even for those, there are countries that are part of the treaty that don't have legal abortion, but nonetheless, they agree to provide as much reproductive care as they can provide within the scope of their own national laws. The treaty affirms that women have a right to choose a family name. A minimum legal age of marriage must be specified. The treaty doesn't say what that minimum age of marriage should be, but it says every country must have a minimum age of marriage. It doesn't say what it is, and some countries set it very low. So in Iraq right now, they're talking about lowering the age of marriage to as young as 9 or 10 years old. Really an unacceptable age, minimum age of marriage. But these are some of the things that are discussed. What should that age of marriage be? And those discussions go on in our country as well. And there's an effort to establish 18 as a minimum age of marriage in the United States, and a number of states have agreed to that. And then finally, children below that minimum age of marriage must not be betrothed or married as people who are too young. So you can see here are a bunch of rights that this treaty sets forth to ask countries to work towards it. And then, as I said, every treaty has a monitoring committee. So there's an accountability mechanism for the Women's Treaty. The CEDAW committee sits in Geneva at the headquarters of the United Nations in Geneva. It's comprised of 23 gender experts that are elected by the parties to the treaty. So the US does not have the right to nominate someone for that monitoring committee because we're not part of the treaty. There are no US nationals on that committee, but there are 23 highly respected women's rights advocates that are elected by the treaty members to sit on that committee. And then countries that are part of the treaty have to submit reports to that committee. Their first report is supposed to go in within 1 year of ratification, and then they're supposed to submit an additional report every 4 years. And then they meet with, the country meets with the CEDAW committee to discuss their report. Questions go back and forth, and finally, the CEDAW committee issues recommendations. They issue recommendations to individual countries, encouraging them to take various steps to advance women's rights in their country. And then the committee also issues general recommendations on topics that across national lines. And this is a way the treaty is updated. So for instance, in 1979, people were just starting to talk about violence in the family. That's widely recognized as a problem today, but in the 1970s, it was not recognized. And so the CEDAW committee issued a general recommendation on violence against women as a way to update the treaty. Okay, so this treaty was developed by 1979. It was voted on by the General Assembly, opened up for signatures. And then in 1980 in Copenhagen, there was another big women's meeting, the Second World Conference on Women. Took place in 1980 in Copenhagen, and 64 countries signed on to the Women's Treaty at that point. And at that time, President Jimmy Carter signed for the United States and transmitted the treaty to the Senate for the Senate's advice and consent on the treaty. And so that was 1980. President Carter sent it to the Senate, and it's still there all these years later, almost 25 years later. The Senate is still sitting on the treaty and has not taken action on it. Now, there have been several hearings. The treaty goes to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so it's under the auspices of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And that committee has held a number of hearings on CEDAW. Twice it's taken votes to vote it out of committee, and both times it was voted favorably out of committee. The first time was in 1994 under President Clinton. Second time was in 2002 under President Obama. Both those times, the Senate was under the control of Democrats. So they debated it, they voted it out to the Senate. However, a vote was not taken on the floor of the Senate before the next election, when that Congress came to an end, and then control of the Senate passed over to the other party. So the upshot is there's never been a vote in the full Senate on CEDAW. And even when Democrats have been in control of the Senate, they have still not had 67 votes. So the Constitution's requirement that there be 67 votes is to ensure that when the U.S. joins a treaty, it's a bipartisan matter. And so at the moment, there is not bipartisan support for joining the International Women's Treaty. By 2024, 189 member states of the UN. UN has about 196 countries in all. 189 member states have joined the CEDAW Treaty. There's only 7 countries globally that have not joined the Women's Treaty, and I've listed them here on the slide. The United States is the only developed nation that has not joined the Women's Treaty. And you can see some of these other countries are not our usual friends, Sudan, Iran, Somalia. These are countries that are very different from the US in terms of their attitude towards women. Tonga and Palau are Pacific Islands, and then the Holy See, the Vatican, have not joined the Women's Treaty. So you can see the US really stands out, as a laggard in not joining the Women's Treaty. And it's, it isn't that the US is not committed to women's rights. We've really been a leader on women's rights. I wanted to put this picture up just to show you. This was another historic moment. The 4th World Conference on Women took place in Beijing in September 1995. President Clinton was president at that time, and the U.S. First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton, went to Beijing and led the U.S. delegation to this World Conference on Women. And she spoke, and her speech was, highly anticipated and applauded. And she made this strong point: human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. Very famous speech given by Hillary Clinton. And it may seem kind of obvious that women's rights and human rights are one and the same, but actually up until that time, women's rights were kind of seen as kind of a specialty, a special interest group. And human rights were seen as kind of the rights of man, meaning not women. But of course, that makes no sense at all. Women are half the human race, and women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. So Hillary Clinton made that point very strongly, really stood up for women's rights at that time. So in the absence of the U.S. Ratifying the treaty and joining the International Women's Treaty, a problem that really makes the U.S. less credible on women's rights around the world. If we want to push Iran on women's rights, Iran can push right back on us and say, you haven't even joined the Women's Treaty, and what leg do we have to stand on? So it hurts U.S. foreign policy in advocating for women's rights internationally when we are not part of the International Women's Treaty. Well, women in the U.S. have tried to work around this problem, and some of the people there today, I know Gail James, and I hope Alice Kitchen is there as well, have been very active in this movement called Cities for CEDAW. Cities for CEDAW is a movement started in the United States in San Francisco and has spread across the U.S. And it's an effort for cities to adopt the principles of CEDAW in their municipal ordinances. Cities vote, city councils or town councils, whatever the structure of government is, vote to adopt the principles of the International Women's Treaty and to bring them into effect in their municipality. And when a city joins the Cities for CEDAW movement, typically there are three things that they undertake to do. The first is to analyze city government from a gender perspective. And often they bring in an outside group to look at gender equality in city government. So not in the city as a whole, but in city government itself. Is there a gender wage gap? What sort of benefits are there for women? What are the rights that women on the city staff have? So there's a gender analysis of city government, and then the cities create an oversight body to monitor implementation of CEDAW. Usually there's some committee, the Committee on the Status of Women or the Women's Council, some sort of committee is created to serve as the oversight body for implementing the Women's Treaty in that municipality. And then the city agrees to allocate funding. And these are the guidelines that the Cities for CEDAW movement puts forth. 10 to 25 cents per female resident in the city should be allocated to help this committee with its implementation efforts. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the cities that have done this. There were about 50 cities in all so far. So there's a very significant number of cities that have done this and are in some measure trying to implement the International Women's Treaty. San Francisco, as I said, was the very first one. They organized after the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995 and passed an ordinance to adopt the principles of the Women's Treaty. I think it was like 1997, 1998 that San Francisco went forward to do that. And they did a gender analysis. They established an oversight body. They allocated funds. And these were some of the things that they did as an outcome, just as an example. of some of the things that have helped women once the International Women's Treaty is used as kind of a guideline for advancing women's rights. In San Francisco, they found that there was a huge gender wage gap, that male employees were paid much, much more than women employees were paid. And the reason was that, the high-paying positions were all filled by men, especially high-paying positions on the police force, high-paying positions in the fire department, heads of departments. All those top positions were going to men, and then the women were holding some of the positions that paid much less. And so San Francisco, instituted a program to really encourage women to get into those non-traditional positions, firefighter positions, police positions, public works positions, and encourage women to think about that, and found ways to move women into some of those positions as a way to reduce the gender wage gap. Another problem they found in San Francisco was that, I think all of us know this, women don't feel very safe on a dark street at night. And so San Francisco realized they could just bring more lighting onto those dark streets by moving the light poles closer together. So they, as part of their public works approach, shortened the distance between light poles on their city streets. So there would be less dark areas on the city sidewalk as women were walking. And so women would feel more comfortable with more light on the streets. Another thing San Francisco did was to look at the domestic violence policies of the police department. And they realized there was a lot they could do to, handle domestic violence cases much more intelligently and thoroughly. And they had great luck doing this when they revised the police procedures. They totally eliminated all domestic violence homicides for a space of 4 years, after having, unfortunately, regular murders of women in domestic situations. By changing some of their domestic violence procedures, they really were much more effective at dealing with domestic violence. So those are just some examples of what San Francisco did. There are some other, let me just go through a couple of other cities that have done things. Los Angeles was the second city for CEDAW. Los Angeles looked at gender parity on boards and commissions to see what was the balance on these boards and commissions that are often our volunteer positions, or they pay, just a token amount. And those are real decision-making positions for the city. So they looked at that and aimed to get gender parity, and had a lot of success in getting a 50-50 balance on those boards and commissions. They also looked at domestic violence procedures and sexual abuse procedures. And of course, Los Angeles is a huge city, and they realized they had to decentralize their police response to those violence against women situations. And so they established police response teams in every city area around Los Angeles. So there was a little more accessible for women to make complaints, and then the police could follow up on the complaints more effectively too. And then Los Angeles also looked at this gender wage gap problem and established a girls' camp under the fire department to encourage, young girls, teenage girls, to think about becoming firefighters. And taught them a little bit about what it meant to be a firefighter, really encouraged them to train and take steps to improve their candidacy for becoming a firefighter, and encourage them to apply. And so that's another important way to reduce the gender wage gap. And then Kansas City, since some of you at least are in Kansas City, Kansas City also is a city for CEDAW, and I'm sure that Gail and Alice could tell you much more about that. So one of the things that Kansas City has looked at also is gender parity in appointment of department heads in the city. How can they, when the mayor appoints a city department head, how can that be done on a more gender equal basis? The city council, I understand, passed a resolution eliminating salary history in hiring. So if salary history is considered in hiring, women tend to get paid less, because since they get paid less to begin with, then if that's the basis for establishing their new salary, it's going to be less than a man who gets paid more. And so by eliminating consideration of salary history entirely, it's a way to bring about more equality in the pay between men and women. And then another effort Kansas City has been involved in is in the post-Dobbs environment, ensuring that the city worker health plans guarantee access, continuing access to contraception. So no matter what might happen on a statewide or a citywide national basis, that city workers in Kansas City would still have access to contraception. So these are just some examples of things cities have done. There are many, many, many more examples from the Cities for CEDAW movement. And it's a way that, women can genuinely work towards women's rights in their city, even in the absence of Senate action on the International Women's Treaty, and a great way to advance women's rights. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for that presentation. Next, we'll move to some words from Elahe Amani, who is an internationally recognized human rights activist with leadership roles in the Coalition of Women from Asia and the Middle East, and board chair of the Women's Intercultural Network, which is championing cities for the CEDAW movement. She's led delegations to the UN and 2 NGO forums of the Commission on the Status of Women. As a skilled peacemaker and conflict resolution expert, she is a senior trainer with Mediators Beyond Borders and serves on National Association for the Community Mediation Board. She is a renowned writer in English and on Persian on human rights, with a distinguished career in the California State University system. Thank you so much. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Greeting to everybody from Long Beach, California, and thank you, Women's Coalition of Kansas City and IRC for this, for your invitation. Particularly, I want to thank Dr. Gail James on the board of Women's Intercultural Network. And actually, as we are talking about CEDAW, the person who kept the light on Cities for CEDAW for 10 years, issuing progress report on Cities for CEDAW. And I want to appreciate previous speakers that that mentioned about Cities for CEDAW. It's an honor to share microphone with Susan. Thank you, Susan, for your presentation. So just to briefly continue what Susan shared with you, as of 2024, 15 cities and counties in United States have issued ordinances on CEDAW, including the 3 counties of Los Angeles counties, Santa Clara counties, and San Diego County. So the 3 counties are all in California, and 15 cities have ratified, actually issued ordinances on CEDAW and put that in their city's law. So including Washington, D.C., and as was mentioned in Kansas City, and also other countries, Honolulu, Cincinnati, Toledo, Pittsburgh, and Berkeley, California, and other cities. Also, I want to mention that as of 2024, 76 cities have issued resolution on Cities for CEDAW. So we see that the public support and grassroots efforts on cities for CEDAW is really encouraging, and that should be a very important aspect of that. The general public in US, particularly in some states more than others, support ratification of CEDAW at national level. So my part of this presentation is about the impact of cities for CEDAW globally. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which is established an international Bill of Rights for women and girls in all their diversity. So that's the term, that inclusive and intersectional term that United Nations used. As of April of 2024, 7 countries have not ratified the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. In Africa, Somalia and Sudan. In Americas, only United States, and in Asia and Pacific, Iran, Niue, Palau, and Tonga, which some of these 3 Pacific islands in Pacific region, they usually said that if you pass by plane, it's hard to see them. So they're very small. So the main country in Asia, the biggest country in Asia that has not ratified CEDAW is Iran. So as an Iranian American that was born and raised in Iran and now citizen of United States, I have every reason to advocate for CEDAW and kind of encourage that this is the Bill of Rights of Women, and we need to embrace it everywhere in the world. So I go by region. I thought in this short time frame we can kind of include the regions of the world so we have a better picture. And I started by, I will start by EU countries, because often when we talk about human rights or women's human rights, many people in our country, in United States, they think, okay, yes, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, of course, there are a gross violation of human rights, women's human rights. But we don't usually compare ourselves to Europe and other where we are standing on gender equality cap compared to other countries. So I start with EU countries. The impact of CEDAW in EU countries has been very significant in promoting gender equality and non-discrimination. So all 27 EU member states are parties to CEDAW, with most having no reservation on its substantial articles. And reservation on international conventions, including CEDAW, it's a term referred that if a country is signing a convention but has concern on certain language or certain part of that conventions, then they put reservations. So they bracketed that part and they say, we sign it, but except those that they are in parentheses or bracketed. So that's the reserve. All 27 EU member states are parties with no reservation. The convention has influenced legislative reforms and policy framework across EU countries, facilitating progress in areas like employment, political representation, and protection from gender-based violence. However, challenges remain, as in Europe and all over the world, such as delayed reporting and the need for better implementation strategies, as seen in countries like Poland, where societal and political resistance has hindered progress. Today, all 27, as I mentioned, 27 EU member states are parties. 4 of these EU countries, namely Hungary, Poland, Portugal, and Sweden, ratified the convention as early as 1980, the year in which it was opened for signature. Austria, Bulgaria, Romania joined them in 1982. So we see that a really European country embraced and ratified CEDAW very quickly. And then Denmark, Finland, and Greece in 1983. By 1994, 30 years ago, all of the current EU member states were parties to CEDAW. With the exception of Estonia, Latvia, and Malta, all of them are also state parties to the optional protocol of CEDAW. Majority of the EU member states have no reservation on any of the substantive articles of the convention, which those are the articles number 1 through 16. The EU member states that maintain such reservation, those that they have reservation, are requested by the committee to explain the practical effect. I want to highlight practical effect of those reservations on the implementation of CEDAW to indicate steps taken to keep the reservation under review. With the goal of withdrawing, I'm sorry, I just jumped. So the it jumped on my reading. Okay. So so between so the practical impact, meaning the material consequences of inequality, as well as the transformation of societal norms that facilitate and perpetuate the uneven distribution of resources, responsibilities, and power between men and women, are often not adequately supported by law and subject to the discretion of policymakers. Full implementation of the EU member states' obligations under CEDAW, and therefore de facto substantive gender equality, remain elusive, even in those EU member states with the most advanced gender equality laws and policies. So although CEDAW is the principal and most comprehensive international legal instrument, its transformative potential has been underused in the formation of EU laws. The EU laws and policies aimed at the achieving gender equality would gain an added value if CEDAW is used as a substantive international legal framework in formulating EU gender equality legislations. So I have to mention that EU have a human rights protocol for all EU countries. So this, what I shared is referred to whether that is more progressive or CEDAW, and in a whole host of research done, CEDAW has more potential. So that's why here I refer to underused CEDAW potential for EU countries. So furthermore, the EU countries should have a more uniform approach in referring to CEDAW in its policy program strategies and internal and external actions. This leaves women's right to equality under CEDAW out of the scope of EU laws. Appropriate steps which would include the substantive and multifaceted equality approach, requiring not only equality of opportunities, but also equality of results and addressing intersectional discrimination in all areas of public, private, and family life, are therefore paramount for effectively addressing structural gender and sex-based inequalities. So to conclude this part, the research referring that to human rights of Europe, and in comparison to CEDAW, and CEDAW has more potential for intersectional equality, particularly when it comes to the influx of migrants from North Africa and the Middle East to European country. This issue is very much being discussed currently in human rights communities of Europe. The next one is impact of CEDAW in East Asia, in 3 countries of East Asia. In Japan, Japan ratified CEDAW in 1985. It is a stable democracy, and women's organizations can freely participate in the CEDAW reporting process. I want to emphasize that because in some countries that we really don't have a good democratic system, while they ratified CEDAW, but women are not allowed to report to CEDAW committee the discrimination that they're experiencing. But Japan, women can freely participate in CEDAW reporting process, as evidenced by the large number of critical shadow reports filed by the CEDAW committee. So shadow report is usually referred to the reports of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to the international bodies. Yet Japan is widely considered to be one of the worst jurisdictions in East Asia for gender equality. The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap reports that Japan ranks at 125 out of 146 nations. So does that mean CEDAW did not have any impact in gender equality in Japan? Actually, the limited progress has been made directly linked to CEDAW. Between 1981, that CEDAW was signed, and 1985, that CEDAW was ratified in Japan, many discriminatory laws on the book, including a nationality law that followed the principle of a traditional patriarchal system, was changed in preparation for Japan's ratification of CEDAW. But public support for allowing public support for allowing a married couple to retain their separate surname has been increased. Another impact of CEDAW was the same surname law. As we know, this will make it difficult for government, as the public support for women and men when they get married, they each have the right to keep their surname, has been increased. And so if the law is eventually reformed, there is little doubt that CEDAW reporting process will have played a role in this part of Japan's law. The second country that I choose to report on the impact of CEDAW is South Korea. South Korea ratified CEDAW in 1984 and initially filed reservation to Article 9, which is about nationality, Article 16, equal rights in all matters related to marriage and family relation. So signed CEDAW, but put reservation on these 2 important articles of CEDAW. South Korea is a good example of why reservations do not necessarily indicate that a country will not take its obligation seriously. In some cases, reservation indicates that the government's lawyers have studied the treaty and know that the country cannot immediately comply with it. So generally, the public understanding of reservation is the country, there is no political will to accept that part of the convention, CEDAW. But South Korea proved that it could be other reasons, and it's always a very unique example of this case. South Korea has gradually amended its law and has now withdrawn all the reservation except Article 16, which is on part of Article 16, which is about personal rights. In addition to amending numerous discriminatory laws, South Korea has adopted a code of system to increase women's political participation and established a National Human Rights Commission which can investigate violations of women's rights. South Korea has taken several measures to comply with CEDAW's recommendation, just to sum up, on particularly domestic violence, including legislation that South Korea enacted the Special Act for the punishment of domestic violence and the Act on Prevention of Domestic Violence and Protections of Victims. These laws provide protective orders, restrict offenders' access to victims, and offer medical and counseling support. Another aspect of that is protective measures. Judges can issue orders to remove offenders from victims' proximity and restrict communication, something that we have also in this country, in United States, for protecting victims of domestic violence. Non-compliance with these orders can result in punishment or fines. And the last one is government initiative. The government has increased effort to combat domestic violence through comprehensive legislative plans and has allocated resources for victim support and offender rehabilitation, something that offenders rehabilitation is an area of concern that we really, in the United States, we don't have a robust and effective system for that. So the last country in East Asia that I like to share I like to share about how CEDAW impacted that country is China. China ratified CEDAW in 1980 and filed no reservation, apart from a statement that it would not consider itself bound to Article 29, which is procedural in nature rather than substantial. CEDAW reporting process matters to the Chinese government on some level, as it frequently adopts a new law just prior to a review by CEDAW committee. For example, in October of 2022, China amended the law on protection of women's rights and interests. The new provisions went into force on January 1st, 2023, just a few months before the CEDAW committee public review of China's 9th periodic report. The reservation at least partially addressed past concern of the committee. So China do every effort to please and have a good record with CEDAW committee. For example, the new law now specifically prohibits certain discriminatory actions, such as restricting a job to males or requiring a newly hired employee to undergo a pregnancy test, something that was happening in China, in many parts of China. China has also strengthened the provisions prohibiting sexual harassment and they increased the potential penalties, including possible criminal penalties for sexual harassment. As for example, for employees who fail to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, it could be even criminal penalties. However, the committee also reiterated many long-standing concerns, including the lack of comprehensive definition of what is unlawful discrimination and the absence of special measures to increase women's representation in government, the judiciary, and other public institution. Also, women have suffered during the privatization of Chinese economy, and gender inequality has actually increased in recent years. So China is now ranked at 107 in the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, above Japan, but slightly below South Korea. Another continent that I like to share is Africa. The impact of CEDAW in Africa has been notable, with conventions being seen as a success story across the continent. Out of 54 African states, only Somalia and Sudan have not signed or ratified CEDAW. CEDAW has been used by advocates to hold state accountable, and its provisions have been invoked in legal cases to advance women's rights. African leaders have generally been receptive to these efforts, and the convention has influenced constitutional changes and policy reforms. However, challenges remains, particularly in applying international standards to local contexts and addressing discriminatory family laws. CEDAW has influenced constitutional changes in several African countries by promoting gender equality and women's rights. Many countries have incorporated CEDAW principle into their constitutions, leading to reforms in family law, property rights, and protection against gender-based violence. For instance, in Maputo Protocol, inspired by CEDAW, has been ratified by numerous African nations, reinforcing constitutional commitment to gender equality. Africa is home to diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups with varied family law structures, so challenges persist in aligning CEDAW and other international standards and local contexts and fully implementing these changes. So another aspect of challenges in Africa, particularly North African countries, is that the Sharia law, in particularly Muslim majority society, and the challenges of Sharia law in implementing the principles of CEDAW. Another progress, but CEDAW definitely made progress in Africa on child marriages, is one of the notable progress in Africa. Absolute bans on marriage under 18 exist in many countries of Africa. DRC, Egypt explicitly guarantee gender equality and has provisions to eliminate discrimination against women, reflecting its their commitment to CEDAW principle. I like to in South Asia also, because of deep-rooted patriarchal society in South Asia, we see that while all South Asian countries actually have ratified CEDAW, but CEDAW implementation remained very challenging in the countries of South Asia. Although, for example, India has a very powerful woman community and feminist community, but we also see that implementation of CEDAW principle has been challenged by the tradition and the patriarchal power structure in India. I like to mention, say a few words about Afghanistan, one of the countries in South Asia, that in Afghanistan, Women's Intercultural Network, as many of you may know or have heard, we have circles in different parts of the country the country, different part of the world. We had circle in Japan, Uganda, Afghanistan, and Iran. And in May of 2003, few months after Karzai took power in Afghanistan, from May 4 to 14, a women's intercultural network, 8 women, including myself, we went to Kabul. We were not allowed to leave Kabul because the State Department clearly advised us, because they were not, it wasn't a safe environment. Speaking Farsi and Persian and Dari, which is close, we understand each other's very clearly. When I went in 2003 to Afghanistan, I took the Farsi translation of CEDAW with my to Afghanistan, and meeting were arranged with all leaders of the country at the time, including President Karzai, including the Shah, including all the anything related to women's issue, and the newly appointed Dr. Huguk Mal, which she was the first woman who was assigned to Women's Affairs Ministry. So when we met with her, I shared with her that I brought a Farsi translation of CEDAW to them. And because Afghanistan, after Karzai took power, immediately signed CEDAW, and they plan on ratifying CEDAW. So Dr. Huguk Mal asked me that, can you do a workshop for us? And of course, my answer was sure. So in the biggest girl high school in Kabul, they quickly invited all NGOs, Afghan NGOs in Kabul, and I did a workshop on CEDAW and in what ways CEDAW can shape gender equality in Afghanistan. So it's unfortunate that right now in Afghanistan, not only those rights are not being respected, but also the basic rights, like the rights of girls to education and women's rights to gain employment, really basic rights are being violated by Taliban. And the issue of CEDAW and Afghanistan is an issue very complex, being discussed, and different perspectives on it. So that's a practical. Also in Iran, there were some efforts during more moderate President Khatami for signing and ratification CEDAW by some religious communities that they felt implementing CEDAW does not have conflict with Sharia law, with the progressive interpretation of Sharia law. But those efforts was prevented, and definitely no rights of women is being respected in Iran, particularly any of the articles of CEDAW. So in conclusion, globally, which I left many part of it because we have limited time. In conclusion, under CEDAW and other international law instruments, where there is a clash between cultural practices and religious norms and the right to gender equality, it is the right to gender equality that must have normative hegemony, in my opinion. At the international level, this hierarchy of values have been adopted in international treaties and in decisions of international treaties, bodies, and tribunals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elahe. All right, just as a reminder, everyone will now be transitioning to an in-person panel with Karenbeth Zacharias, Gail James, and Alice Kitchen. So that will be taking place now in the back of the room, so the people on Zoom will be able to see. So I'll invite you to flip your chairs around, or if you'd like to have a table in front of you, I might invite you to come back to a row so you can get in the back row. But yes, we'll just get settled here and try to start here in the next minute or two. So bear with us, people on Zoom. We'll be starting here very shortly.
Yes, I'm in town for cities, especially out there. Implementing it. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. What we are what to say. I mean, every time yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad we're listening to it.
Yes.
Well, I like scale, right? She has been together, right? Yeah. Those are on Crystal. Yeah, just turn it on. I feel like it's hard. Just yeah.
I think she's just there.
Hello, I'm Gail James, resident of Metro Kansas City, which includes Kansas and Missouri and many, many counties that are in our jurisdiction. And I'm very pleased and thankful to the International Relations Council, which serves Greater Kansas City, with outstanding and prestigious speakers over many decades, and I want to include our speakers today in that pantheon, because that was fascinating material. And I speak to you as someone who studies and works in the CEDAW space, as we call it, and in our network over the last decades. You have really given me a lot of food for thought, as well as background to those who are unfamiliar. It's really very, very good of you to join us today. We thank you, Dr. Lee and Amani, Elahe Amani, for joining us. One of the purposes of this part of the panel is to give you some a local look of what we're doing here locally, and then also to have time for some questions for our speakers and to give you a chance to ask your burning questions. One thing I will say to start is that the impetus of the UN, the United Nations, and when it started UN Women a few decades ago, it indicated this wish to have global movement affecting local and having local impact, so that people in the local jurisdictions, wherever you are, can still benefit and understand and work in with global treaties. So oftentimes we know that we think of human rights affecting migrant workers and refugees. We don't see it as affecting us locally. So that what we want to say is that global reality is really impacting local reality. Human rights affect us in our daily lives every day. How you work, what your transportation needs are, how you interact with neighbors, all of that have to do with human rights at the local immediate level in our jurisdictions. And that's why when the ratification did not work in the Senate for the global UN treaty for CEDAW, the Women's Intercultural Network and Marilyn Fowler, who also was a Kansas City resident, understood we can bypass the Senate and we can now institute CEDAW principles in local jurisdictions by creating a resolution, which is a statement of support and affirmation, or a real ordinance, which is a legal document and affect the laws and policies of a given city or county. And so that's how we proceeded. That was launched in 2014, and in 10 years, we have almost 100 cities that have some reality in the CEDAW domain, whether it's an actual ordinance or a resolution, or they're exploring how it might work. And the reason I mention the Women's Intercultural Network is because that organization, that nonprofit, understood that working with the CEDAW Commission, the CEDAW Committee in Geneva, was instrumental in support of what we do on the ground at the grassroots level. So in Kansas City, and I will pass this to Alice because you'll be very interested to know that we started right from the launch in 2014 with our coalitions, working very closely with League of Women Voters and AAUW, Zonta, NOW, and all the other organizations, Women's Political Caucus, Seroptimus, that are a part of our local and labor groups, working with the Women's Equality Coalition. And in 2014 had a resolution ready to go with this mayor. And so now we are two mayors and 3 city councils later, and we're still working on it, but have accomplished a great deal. Thanks to the efforts of my colleague Alice Kitchen, but also the Women's Equality Coalition, and also a city council that understood what we were trying to accomplish. And we had dialogue with them. So I'll leave you with the final element in support of a CEDAW initiative is really coalition building, working in our groups, whether in universities and student centers and all of the women's organizations and NGOs that are interested in promoting social justice, economic justice, human rights for women and girls in all their diversity. This has helped create a bonding among all of us, but also creates a momentum for going forward into the future. And so here I'm going to now introduce Alice Kitchen, who will tell you a little bit more about the Gender Equity Commission and what we're doing here. Have you on?
Is this working?
Sure.
Is it working? Yes, and I would tell you that on the side counter here, there are documents here that are about the organization, the national organization that Dale is talking about, and the list of the cities that are included that have resolutions and where it all stands. And also there was an 87-page report on the website for the Women's Intercultural Network. So yeah, in 2014, we passed, the city council passed an ordinance without even our presence, and we've been working to implement the intent of that, as Gail said, 3 city councils later. And so that resolution included what you've been hearing about all afternoon, and that is you have a gender study, you have a commitment to parity, and we have a 60-page document on how the wages are distributed in the city by male and female, by departments and so forth. And so we have those benchmarks, and we also have a commitment. Although we didn't get an ordinance, we had hoped for a women's commission. And what we got was, because they were tired of having one more commission and one more entity that they weren't monitoring, and they were not wanting to endorse one more, and they had some challenges in the city council regarding commission and board. So what we got was an appointment of myself to the Kansas City Human Rights Commission, which is a part of the Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity Department, one of the 20 departments in the city of Kansas City. So after that appointment, I was able to create a subcommittee, which is also in the city ordinance. And instead of calling it Women's Commission, we called it Gender Equity, because we wanted the full spectrum of women. And so after that, we have been working, we meet on a monthly basis, and we're broken down into parity. In other words, elected and appointed office. It's been really important that women be in decision-making roles. We've looked at health and public safety. When the Dobbs decision hit, we went to the city council, we made our statement, and they have also, as the city council, voted not only to ensure the health benefits of the women employees, but also transportation, whatever it took to get an abortion. So we felt really in good stead, but we also had a listening session. And we invited women, all different beliefs, to come and share their stories. And so what we had was that women who had had abortions told their stories. Nurses talked about young girls needing abortions. And we had pro-life speaker who talked about the position of pro-life. And it was all about my experience, not telling you what you should do. And we respected all of it. And the pro-life leader from Kansas came up and said afterwards, you did what you said you were going to do. I think it's really important as women of all different beliefs and experiences that we respect each other. And that's part of the solidarity that we have to. There are things that we disagree on. So anyway, after that, we did the salary history, as you know, and you know the importance of that. And now we're working to get enshrined in city government in an ordinance that affirms what we're already doing. And one thing that Gail may not have said, but it's really true. All of these cities have very different structures. And you have to go in a different path. And we took a circuitous path to get to where we are. But we are in a department that has a budget, can investigate, and has regulatory authority. So we're in a good place. And that's really helpful, but we have more to do. And as I said, Councilwoman Melissa Robinson is our advocate now, and she is already introduced an ordinance that will not only affirm our role publicly, but also require every city department to do an annual report that talks about 4 things. And one is moving women up into decision-making roles. Another one is training on public safety. And the one that I'm most proud about is that we're working with gender-based violence in the workforce. And we're going to come up with tangible, measurable items. And everything we do is based on, we have goals and visible indicators and benchmarks and progress. So it's going to be like a performance improvement plan. And every department will start out with where they are, but then we will review those every year. So I think I'm going to pass it on to Karenbeth.
Hi.
As I'd like to add before Karenbeth speaks is that Dr. Karenbeth Zacharias is an angel. We don't have many CEDAW angels, but this is one who represents to us a helper and supporter and a United Nations Association leader that really is our backbone because we all need that kind of support. But in addition, it represents an uplifting, an elevation of the kind of work we do on the ground. So thank you, Karenbeth, for joining us.
Oh, that was way over the top. I'm Karenbeth Zacharias, and I'm the president. Right now, I'm the president of the United Nations Association of Greater Kansas City. That is, and I have been to the Convention on the Status of Women because of Gail James several times at the UN. And it is an extraordinary experience to meet women across the world who are there to have conversations about their lives and the importance of CEDAW well, not CEDAW, but the convention itself in their world. So what Gail said, I want to emphasize about the local global experiences is absolutely true. It is a fascinating and extraordinary experience to listen to women from all over the world talk about as if they were down the street from you in some ways. In my day job, I am a professor of history, the division chair of humanities and liberal arts at the University of St. Mary, and the director of the STAR Center for Global Peace and Justice. And so in that way, I also have the privilege of participating in the work that Alice and Gail do. The United Nations is a complicated place, and it's a complicated framework right now. I can remember sitting at a breakfast many years ago, 2014, where we were warned, do not say the word United Nations, it will turn politicians off. So this global body for peace is something that is a highly contested thing. The question that people keep asking or wondering, why don't we ratify these, is because we don't want to be held to account. One of the things that Gail James does so extraordinarily is she represents in Geneva the work that is done in the United States. So she is that extraordinary connection in that way. But it is a movement that is deeply rooted in the needs of our communities. We are not different than other communities. We have in some ways more privileges and in other ways less. And so the UN Women, there is a UN Women organization in the auspices of UNA-GKC, has programs, and it is probably the most thriving portion of our organization. For instance, Margaret Atwood is coming to the library, but in preparation for that, she has authored, co-edited a book of essays on democracy that UN Women are having a little book reading. That my book is sitting at home and delivered today from Amazon. It just came out. But I think 12 women have written about democracy across the world and the participation of democracy. And so these global conversations, we're getting together on the 16th of September to talk about them. So if that's something that interests you, please reach out and we'll be happy to participate. The IRC has been also a leader in areas to do with these important conversations. I would just say very quickly, one takeaway, and it's something to think about in the simplicity of the questions and the importance of the questions that are being asked. The San Francisco report, way back in the day when it started, one of the things that they were curious about is why women didn't work in waste management, specifically picking up trash. It was one of the highest paid jobs in the city, and yet women didn't participate. Anyone want to guess why?
Much like regular life.
Well, close, but no. It's because the job started at 6 o'clock in the morning, and women who had children didn't have the luxury of working at that hour of the day. So what they figured out was if you stagger start times, women can participate in this way. So by asking the question, which is the basis of what Gail and Alice are doing, in asking the questions, the answers become not more complex, but in many ways more simple. You just have to make some adjustments, and women are active participants in the process.
Just add one more thing that you know that the ERA is not enshrined in the Constitution. We have ratified it. And there's documents over here, if you have not had a chance to find the national one, which has been around for a while, please find it. But we need the ERA and we need city for CEDAW. We need a federal law, but we need local enforcement and local watchdog. So local is really important.
We'd love to have some questions. Evan, it's up to you to tell us what time we have and how you want that to be.
About 20 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, either here in the room or on Zoom, invite you to.
Carol Coles. I don't know if everyone can see you. I suppose they can't.
I don't know either, and I don't know without a mic whether it works, but
Yeah,
The-
microphones are in the ceiling. So if you're in the room, just kind of direct your
Okay.
questions up there.
the question is that what I'm hearing is, governmental impetus and working with government. What's the probability or the possibility that this filters into the private sector? And I know that we've had an experience in Kansas City, and I wanted to make sure that maybe Alice could address it.
So if you're talking about into the private sector, I can't say we made a big dent. I know we talked with the chamber, we have ways to go, and if you have ideas, or anyone else here has ideas.
Well, the salary history.
But the salary history is included. And thanks to you who testified at one of our city council meetings, we got that passed in an ordinance for city employees, but also for the whole city, which is 300 miles. So every employer, and we also passed the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act, local enforcement. All employers of 6 employees and above are obliged to follow that.
There is an organization, it's actually an NGO that's called CEDAW for Companies, started by a friend of ours for the the Intercultural Youth Network. It also is modeled on a UN initiative of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon back a while to identify 1,000 companies across the world that subscribed to gender equity principles. They're called the Gender Equity Principles, and that you can find that on the UN website. Those companies that adhere to that. But here in the United States, we haven't had that much luck in the private sector, but there is an initiative happening. Susan and Elahe, I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, but I know that there are companies that have gender equity principles already working.
I don't know a great deal about it, but I do believe in San Francisco. That San Francisco started to move into the private sector. The Department on the Status of Women, that was the city department that was monitoring the CEDAW ordinance, started to dialogue with companies in San Francisco. And I don't know too many details about it, but that was the next step. And I think they use those gender equity principles and try to bring them into the San Francisco private companies. And so it started with a dialogue. It wasn't like a law that they had to do it, but rather a dialogue between the women's rights advocates in city government and the private companies to try to show them how much it would be in their best interest to try to advance gender equity. And I think there has been some acknowledgement of that in corporations that, during the 2008 downturn, there were studies that showed that companies with a board of directors with women on the board did a little better than companies with boards of directors that were all male. That the influence of the women on the board of directors tended to be a voice for caution and proceeding cautiously, and that helped companies during that 2008 downturn. So there has been some corporate interest in advancing gender equality as a good business principle.
Thank you.
Yes, Elahe, you have a comment?
It's my understanding that CEDAW impacts gender equality in the private sector, although there's not a whole host of research on that. By encouraging states to implement, and this is embedded in different recommendation of CEDAW, by implementing policies that promote non-discrimination, equal opportunities for women and employment in general. So a good segment of women are participating in private sectors globally. So that's one aspect that, yes, we can hold companies also in that realm, because this is equal opportunity for women in public and private. The other aspect is we see a trend, a growing trend with UN agencies bringing public-private partnership. This is kind of new trend in UN. And for example, most recent youth initiative on UN or environment, or global UN is moving because of the, of course, that's discussion in my opinion, because of the rise in right-wing populist movements globally and religious extremism. The budgets of the governments are shrinking for issues like gender equality and other social services that women are the main beneficiary. So with that, UN, you see a growing trend in UN that bringing public-private sectors in support of UN initiative. So, and of course, Dr. Susan Lee explanation on San Francisco is absolutely correct. One thing also, another aspect that in Europe, and we see it in United States, actually in the media, Women's Intercultural Network, with the support of our dear leader, Dr. Gail James, we hold in March, as we were attending the UN Commission on the Status of Women, we see that in more states, equal pay for equal work is also including equal pay for equal value. That's another new trend that in US and Los Angeles, I know they're working on that. Not necessarily equal pay for equal work in public and private, equal pay for equal value of the work. So how you compare for example, in a school system, the woman who work in the kitchen to prepare the lunch for the school kids to the bus driver that brings the students to school. So kind of our growing discussion. To me, it all tied on by CEDAW respecting girls' rights.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I thought I saw another hand.
Yeah.
Karen? Yes.
Once you put all the committees together, you have the ordinances and the laws you stick in. How do you make sure that this is actually enforced on the ground rather than you'll just quietly ignore it?
Well, we study it kind of like at the national level. They have annual reporting. And so in our gender equity task force, we look for the elected and appointed office, we can count, and then we have different departments that intersect with us. We've been working with the Human Resources Department. The gender study that we got, it was comprehensive in terms of and gender, but it didn't do equity. And I think that's what a lot of talking about. Equity is education, skills, and experience. And that's different for each person. And so we wanted that, so we're pushing for that. And also more definition of LGBTQ other personnel for the sake of safety and protection when wanted and needed. So the enforcement is in those three categories that I talked about. domestic violence is the most difficult one of all. We've tried listening sessions and it became too dangerous, and attic. And then we tried it online and we're still working on it and, now working with, Women's Bureau around gender-based violence in the workforce. And we think we can get some more handles on schools and, standards. But it's ongoing. And in fact, with the city, there was a noticeable lack of, or women in upper management positions, largely directors, who were leaving, forced out, or put in a position that they weren't qualified for, therefore leaving and complained. So we talked to our mayor about that and we questioned him. We've also had different departments come in and respond, and we've commented on the hiring of the city manager, renewing his contract. And we hold our city people accountable. And although they don't always listen, they know that we're watching, and that's our goal, and that's our job.
Judy Ansel, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. A lot of young women I know don't understand what it was like in the 1950s when a lot of us were girls. And I wonder, like, I look around this room and I see that a whole lot of us remember the 1950s, let's put it that way. What are you guys doing, or, like, what are you aware of being done to try to pass this on so that when we all pass from the scene, that these kinds of struggles will continue?
I would love to have all of our persons comment on that, but I will say that UN Women has a Youth for CEDAW initiative, and that is very encouraging because they just had a town hall recently. So there's a way, that's what we need to do. We want to pass the torch. We want that to be a reality. But those of you who work with students, Dr. Zacharias and Dr. Lee, you can talk about it. And I know that Elahe has brought young women onto our board and is eagerly looking at ways to pass the learning as well as the torch.
Part of the conversation, I taught you Women in World History last spring. And one of the interesting parts of that conversation was exactly what you asked. What will spark them to care? So I had them do an NGO project that had to focus on women and girls. And the 3 NGO projects each group did centered around Title IX. 80% of the students at USM are athletes. So Title IX is a very important conversation, in particular sexual violence and how do you protect yourself. And so it is in part encouraging them to find the thing that they care about. They can't be the thing that we cared about, because as soon as you say the 1950s or the 1990s, eyes kind of start glazing over. Oh, that was the olden times. I'm like, yes, so long ago. Dinosaurs roam. But finding what will spark them. What do they care about? And instilling in students, all students, the importance of the things that we should be doing, which is asking questions. I said, be registered to vote. When you vote at the local level and at the state level, you ask people, what is your position on X? What is your position on Y? And it's hard for them to hearken back to something that they have always had and now have lost. But it is also inspiring them. Simone Biles, one of the things that they remember about her in particular is not her athleticism, it's that she faced Larry Nassar and she came out and spoke on that. So what speaks to young people is their experience of other young people just a little bit older than they are. And how do you inspire them is to you reach out. You can talk about a long time ago or the near future, but it is also to remind them, and this is, in Catholic school, I don't really speak of abortion much, but one of the things that I think we miss the conversation on is 1 in 4 women in this country have a miscarriage. And to have a medical access to medical care is to have an abortion. So to change the conversation from a choice that I made to a choice that was made for me, and I must now deal with the consequences. I have a child who desperately wants a child. She had a miscarriage, it broke her heart. The medication that she takes is the medication that is now, somebody's decided it's medication you shouldn't be able to have. In a lot of states in this country right now, you can't have it. But it wasn't because of a choice that she made, which is her right to make the choice, but it was a choice that was made for her. So some of this is the conversations you have with young people are how to make them see that their lives are deeply impacted by the choices that are made in this world. That may be more than one, but it's just like when people, if you think about it, if you're talking about what happened in the 50s and 60s, it's as if in the 50s and 60s that people talked about what was happening in 1910. No, it's like, okay, women didn't have the vote and they wore long dresses. It's just not the same. So it's what today, you know, those are the conversations that they care about.
I will say, too, I'm being on many CEDAW conversations via Zoom around the world. The young women are showing up. They are there. They are speaking up. They are active in their communities, and they have something to say. And it's so encouraging. We don't see it quite so much in the U.S. because CEDAW isn't on the radar in the way that it is in other places. But if we can have a sign-up list and have all your names and emails, we'll let you know when those Zooms take place. You would be most gratified and delighted to see these young women across the country. Susan and Elahe, do you have any comments?
Oh, Susan, please.
Okay, let me just say briefly, I think it's great news that young women don't have to deal with some of the things we dealt with when I was a young person. It's really good that they have these great role models. I didn't have a single female professor when I was in college, and they have women running for president of the United States. They have all these great role models, and I think all that's good. The thing that is they're really going to encounter is once they have children, who's going to take care of the children, and who's gonna be doing the cleaning in the house? That's the frontier that I don't know how much progress there's been made on that frontier yet. It often is the young woman or the little older woman who stays home from work to take care of the children and sacrifices her career with all of the consequences for her overall career progress and eventual Social Security. So it may not affect them when they're in their teens and 20s, but once they get into their 30s, they start to have children. Those childcare problems are problems we still haven't really addressed very much.
Yeah, I also want to share that the question that was, it's a general question in any environment. This is being issued. This is being talk about it, because how to engage, particularly in United States, even in ethnic communities, and women activists together in South community, in the Middle Eastern, North African community, we're discussing. It's not the young generation. To me, that doesn't mean to me that they're not interested in this issue. It means that it has other underlying issues. As a mediator, I usually hold dialogue between our generation of, for example, Iranian feminist activists, gender equality acts, and younger generation. It's my and what my take of that is when our generation talking to younger people, there is a power dynamic. We talk more than we listen. So in order to invite their engagement, we need to listen to them. We need to see what are the issues. If we're talking about gender-based violence, maybe they are more interested in gender-based violence in online than, for example, battery at home. So if by listening to them, which is not one size for all communities, but by listening to them, we know what are the important issues in their relationship, in power dynamic, in what Dr. Susan Lee just mentioned about when they have children, you know, they usually, the research, or at least my reading, is that they usually in United States, younger women feel it, as Susan said, when they are in 30s and 40s, when they want to move in their career, and you know, too much travel for advancing their careers on one hand, and taking care of family is on the, you know, when they really get to that stage, they get more interested. My daughter is the same age as CEDAW. She's 45, and I can see that, you know, she's different focus now with career and other things. She's getting more interested in those power dynamics and addressing that. So overall, I always say we have to listen more, and we don't have to give lecture to them. They hate our lectures, you know. So kind of challenging those power dynamic and let them tell us how we can how our experiences, offering our experiences, can help them to achieve their goals. Thank you.
Because you're Iranian,
We can't hear you.
we're all worried about the women in Iran. Can you tell us a little bit, is there hope for the women in Iran?
Thank you. Thank you. In Iran, as many of you probably read about it, as was making headline in US or in the news media, we had Women Like Freedom movement, really younger women, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is the generation that were born and raised in in current century, 21st century. They were all engaged, and they were leading that effort. They were not following. They were leading that effort of women life freedom. However, after 20,000 were arrested, more than 500 were killed in Iran and other countries. Now the movement is quiet. However, as someone who frequently talk to them, we have conversation on Zoom and other social media, I think it's a fire that is still there and waiting for a safe opportunity to bring up. Women are organizing in a very creative ways in Iran, and on the street, women showing a really bravery that really unbelievable. Women are being arrested because of not wearing hijab, Islamic hijab, that is compulsory. That is compulsory. It's not by choice, because we should respect anyone to choose the way they want to dress. But it's compulsory even for Christian women, even for Jewish women. So regardless of religion, in Iran, wearing hijab is compulsory. So these young women go to prison. When they leave after 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years, they're again not wearing hijab, and they take it back. So it's a very interesting dynamic that's happening in Iran. Unfortunately, because of US foreign policies, keep, uh, keep it quiet in the Middle East. We don't want to be engaged in war and other crazy things happening in the region. So we don't hear about this instance of women now, but it does continue in a variety of forms that particularly younger women are engaged. I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Elahe. On behalf of the Women's Equality Coalition, we want to thank Evan for making this possible, and you want to close it out? Great job.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It means a lot to share the space with you and have this really important discussion. So, Susan, Alani, Karenbeth, Gail, Alice, thank you so much for being part of this and partnering with the IRC for this. So, please, I hope you'll join us again for a future program as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Lovely to
How are
be here.
you?
To see you.
We know Carol.